She walked into my kitchen like she owned the place and let my house exhale when the door slammed behind her. Sophia tossed my keys on the counter and said, without even looking at me, "Have breakfast ready at 5 tomorrow. My husband likes an early start." Then she smiled, that practiced, disarming smile I used to know from childhood photographs, one I recognized too late for the warning it carried. That sentence, simple, presumptuous, domestic, was small enough to be ignored. It was also the hinge that swung open a whole other world. 5 a.m., I thought, and felt something like a report pop in my chest. Not alarm exactly, but the hard, clear sound you get when a pattern begins to reveal itself. Sometimes the thing that wakes you up in the morning is more than an alarm. I live by the sea. That house, my house, sits on a slope where the morning light comes at you slow and generous, where the ocean smells like salt and possibilities. After 30 years of work, after a divorce, and a career that never really let me finish my sentences, I claimed this spot for a quieter life. Gardening, long walks, coffee that I allowed myself to want slowly instead of gulping on the run. My routine was sacred. My sunrise cups belonged to me. Sophia's arrival was abrupt in every way. She carried a duffel bag and a shopping bag with boutique tags flapping like small flags. She had grown into the kind of woman who could make a room feel both smaller and louder. Behind her, wearing an expression so practiced it might have had its own agent, walked Derek Castellano. Polished, soft-spoken, expensive coat. The kind of man who could tell a lie like an apology and make you accept both. They called it a stay. That afternoon it was a stay. By dusk, their language had names for everything. Transition, simplifying, investment opportunities. They explained, between sips of my iced tea, that it was for my own good that I consider selling. In the same breath, they discussed designs for a modern living space that would appeal to younger buyers. Derek said it so smoothly you could almost forget he'd suggested I was outliving my usefulness. I kept my answers short, the way a good defense keeps to facts. Sophia's voice had the sticky sweetness of someone used to getting what she wanted. "Mama, we can help. You don't have to worry about any of the details." She pronounced details like it was a charity. There were humiliations that day that would have been comic if they hadn't been corrosive. They assumed I would serve their morning habit. Derek loved my coffee. He loved my oatmeal. He loved that I kept the afternoon light exactly the way he liked it. They assumed I would be passive, grateful for the help and the security. They slid pamphlets across my counter about downsizing. Less upkeep, more freedom, the header said, as if my entire life of knowledge and stubbornness could be folded into a minimalistic brochure. I thought briefly and with shame of how easy it would be to be complicit. My daughter, my flesh and blood, sitting beside a man who spoke of efficiency and portfolio adjustments as kindly as other people speak of pets. The word portfolio, in a house where my retirement had been painstakingly saved, landed like a small stone in my throat. That night, after they went to bed in the room they had already taken as theirs, I walked the house. I passed the kitchen where her keys had landed. I ran my hand along the counter, feeling the grain of the wood like a map of all the mornings I'd owned. My phone lit up with a message. "Thanks for letting us crash, Mom. We'll help you simplify. Love you." A little heart. I turned the phone off and made my coffee anyway, slower than usual, as if speed could undo the presumptions of the day. If you're watching this and feeling that familiar tilt, tell me where you're watching from. It helps to know whose living room I'm sitting in when I tell you I was not, in fact, ready to be moved. The next morning they slept through my ritual sunrise. Sophia rose late enough to reapply makeup and retell me with cheer a plan for the house she saw in her head. Derek praised my blueberry muffins like they were a rare antique. He called my salt shakers quaint. They spoke about future-proofing like two people swapping recipes. I made the breakfast they expected, set the table at the early hour he liked, and watched him eat as if his approval were rent due. It was all performative, small acts that proclaimed dominion. I understood anger. I had practiced it quietly for years. The arithmetic of small slights added up to compound interest. But this was a new animal. It wasn't just about being slighted. It was about the thinness of the excuse, "We care about you," folded into "you should sell," and the way that care wrapped around a profit motive. There is a particular coldness in someone who believes they can monetize your memory of a house. I started looking for patterns the way some people look for stars, an urge to map what seemed random. I had always been suspicious by habit. At 72, a certain wariness of charm is less paranoia and more survival instinct. The facts started in small places. A casual comment Derek let fall about having a few properties under his name, a voicemail from a woman asking if that was my garden in a photo posted by Sophia, a receipt for a contractor I had never hired. I did what people do when their back is finally up against a feeling. I asked questions. I called Harold Manning, my financial advisor. Harold had been a quiet force in my life since the divorce, an accountant who'd learned to be as patient with grief as with ledgers. If you've ever wanted a person to translate the world of money into English, Harold is that person. I told him, without flourish, what had happened. He did not laugh. He did not suggest I was being dramatic. He asked for Derek's full name, Derek Castellano. The name set Harold's voice to work like a metal detector over a beach. "Let me pull a couple things," he said. "Stay at your house. Don't make any big decisions right now." He sounded like a man asking me to trust him when trust had been harder to come by. Public records are a stubborn thing. They don't sugarcoat. They list dates and deeds and corporate jargon in a way that refuses to be flattering. Derek's name, when Harold returned with it, was associated with more than a few LLCs with benign, forgettable names. Seabreeze Holdings, Meridian Properties, a dozen others that might as well have been receipts from a dinner you can't remember. Some had been dissolved, others had liens. There were legal notices, dryly formatted, about foreclosures that mentioned older homeowners in small towns, whose names tickled a part of me that knew patrons of my own book club and clients of my old law firm. "You're seeing what I'm seeing," Harold said. "A pattern." Pattern is a word that does not feel dramatic until it becomes a story. A pattern is a map of intention. I began to sew together a timeline like a hobbyist detective, the sort of person who organizes receipts by color and circles recurring names. I started with the simplest things: phone calls logged, dates of visits, the shift in demeanor when financial language crept into family conversation. I made a folder, papery, clumsy, a relic of the way my brain still likes to hold things in print. In that folder went the receipts, the head notes, the names of properties that Derek's companies had touched. Then I called Jennifer Walsh. Jennifer's voice came over the phone, small but steady. She used to own a boutique, she told me, a shop that had been the kind of labor of love business that older women open because shopping in retirement should be more than salon gossip. After Derek entered the periphery of her life, dressed in a suit that smelled like citrus and promises, her boutique closed. The details she shared were not necessarily spectacular. They were domestic: unpaid invoices, a check that bounced, a contractor who never paid. The thing about predatory plans is that they are often orchestral in their quietness. One missed payment feels ordinary. One coerced signature looks like assistance. Together, little things are a machine. "You're not the first to call," Jennifer said. "I didn't think it was about money until it was." She paused and told me something that lodged in my head. "He's charming until you stop being useful." I told her I was putting things together. We agreed to meet. Jennifer gave me a list of names, vendors who had tried to collect, a realtor who'd been pushed aside. She let me photocopy invoices that had been left unpaid in a cardboard shoebox. Her voice trembled only once when she said, "I'm sorry, Patricia. I should have seen him." Eleanor Patterson was different. Eleanor's name had appeared in a notice that Harold pulled up. A foreclosure, a house hurriedly sold. When I asked Harold about her, he said hesitantly, "There's a court record here that looks messy." I called Eleanor on an afternoon when gulls kept score along the ridge beyond my porch. She answered slow and cautious, like a woman who didn't speak to strangers, because strangers had once undone her life. Eleanor told me about a man who arrived with flowers and compliments, a man who was solicitous and then strategic. Her house was no longer hers. The foreclosure meant more than loss of property. For Eleanor, it was loss of memory. "I kept the garden for 50 years, she said. "I watered every rose like it was a promise." When she spoke of the house being taken, her voice folded into itself. I could hear the weight of that theft, less transactional than personal. I did not move with the dramatic haste of television heroes. I moved narrowly, methodically. I made lists with columns and shaded headings, dates, names, documents I needed. I used words like foreclosure and power of attorney with the careful respect you owe to letters when they can shift ownership of a life. Harold drew diagrams in pencil, his hands steady, showing me how money flowed between accounts, how companies were layered like matryoshka dolls. Derek's name sat, in places, like a ghost. "You should file something," Harold said at one point. Not flint, not comfort, only a suggestion angled into action. "A complaint. The Attorney General. We can talk to the state people. If it's a pattern, across counties, it can attract federal attention." The idea of law enforcement made me feel vulnerable in a different way than Derek's presumption had. Calling the state was the same kind of breath as stepping off a dock. You don't know whether you'll find grip or you'll find water. But there is a relief in translation. When a private pain finds a public word, its edges change. I started keeping daily notes. I wrote what Sophia said, how Derek moved in my house, the language they used about preparing me. The kitchen took on a new role in my life. I found myself watching it like a stage manager, cataloging props. The mornings, once islands of small joy, became scenes in a play I had not auditioned for. Sophia's complicity or confusion became the hardest thing to parse. She was not villain enough for my anger, and not naive enough for my pity. There were moments when I could see the old girl who'd painted her thumb pink and left her crayons in a shoebox under my bed. There were others when she asked Derek, mid-conversation, whether we should get started on the listing paperwork, and looked at me with the expectation of gratitude. One afternoon, while she lingered in my living room speaking about staging and light, I caught her looking at a framed photograph of my late husband and me at some long-ago summer picnic. She ran a fingertip across the glass, like she was testing whether the picture was part of the set. "You'll be happier somewhere smaller," she said. "You don't have to carry the maintenance." It wasn't cruelty so much as convenience. Convenience is a way people who profit explain themselves. I began to keep one small ritual public and one small ritual private. Publicly, I was gracious. I fed them. I laughed at Derek's jokes with the restraint of someone who watches corny movies under protest. Privately, I wrote every small indignity into the folder, and I traced out the network of names that snapped together like joints. As the months passed, my quiet investigation became less hobby and more obsession. I would wake in the night and scroll through public filings until my eyes blurred, cross-referencing addresses and corporate filings. I learned how to read the dry language of property transfers, the way deeds can be layered to mask a final beneficiary. I learned with a cold and steady fascination that fraud is not often a single act of theft, but a choreography. Trust is invited and then leveraged. And yet, there were moments of domestic normal that cut through the plotting. Sophia helping me prune roses, Derek bringing over a small, ridiculous cake for my birthday, with a single candle like some theatrical apology. There was humor, too, threaded through anger. The way Derek pronounced efficiency like a perfume. The way he learned my coffee order and pretended he'd always liked it, as if his tastes were an act of intimacy. Those little domestic falsehoods made my outrage sharper. They are the kind of intimacy predators practice, the slow mimicry of belonging. There is a moral tension to everything I did next. That is the truth I want to be clear about. I felt temptation. I thought about revenge like a fever. There were moments when the fantasy of making him suffer for my humiliation felt almost elegant. We are human, and we are cruel when hurt. But behind the longing for revenge, there was a clearer reasoning. If patterns are to be broken, someone has to document them. Documentation is a civilized form of retribution. It is evidence with a future. I began to wear my curiosity like armor. I took photographs of receipts, of text message timestamps, of the way Derek's cards swiped at a local contractor's shop. I recorded nothing without consent. I kept what was lawful and what felt honest. I asked questions of neighbors who had seen Derek at other houses. Someone mentioned a man who had introduced himself as Derek at a community center opening. Someone else mentioned a contractor who had been stiffed. Each anecdote was a bead threaded onto a rope. A pattern is not a proof, but it is an argument that demands an audience. One evening, after a day of cold calling vendors and chasing down old invoices, I sat on the stoop of the little coffee shop near my house. The sky was the color of bruised onion skin. Gulls argued over something small and marvelous in the parking lot. My hands, which had once shaken from lack of caffeine and now shook from a different force, tightened over a paper napkin. I wrote "file complaint" across the top of a note and underlined it twice. Harold drove over to sit on my porch. He brought with him, as if he were a consoling priest, a manila folder full of printouts. He had highlighted lines, circled dates, and left margin notes in his tight, disciplined hand. "You've got leverage," he said. "Two similar complaints in neighboring counties. A pattern of unpaid contractors. A transfer deed for Eleanor. If we present this right, if we present victims together, it'll have weight." "Weight is what?" I asked. I never used the word when people asked about my health or my plans. Weight had always felt like something you managed. Now it felt like a currency. "Attention," Harold said. "From the state, from the feds possibly. They like patterns across jurisdictions. There is a particular loneliness to coming alive as someone else's adversary. Your family looks at you like you've become a different person." Sophia looked at me with the resignation of someone who expected to be indulged. When I told her plainly that I was cataloging documents and planning to file complaints, she flicked at her hair and said, "Mama, do you really want to make a fuss?" Her tone implied matters of privacy, of propriety, of not making her husband uncomfortable. Privilege asks for calm while it reorganizes your life. That night I packed a small bag and slept in the guest room the way a practiced activist sleeps before a rally, half frightened, half exhilarated. I dreamed of documents that arranged themselves into a bright, undeniable narrative. The dream felt like an indictment and a release. The next morning, Derek brought me a newspaper clipping about a charity gala he had supposedly sponsored. His photo grinned from the society pages like an endorsement. "It's all about goodwill," he said. "Helping older folks transition." He mentioned a network of people who specialized in property management for seniors and how he'd been doing it for years. He used the word "we" as if his activity were a community service. I felt foul at the word's cheap charm. "Who does the network include?" I asked. He answered with a smile. He said names that sounded like brands. He said, "Do you want me to introduce you to people who can make this easier?" and handed me a business card the color of someone else's life. His card was linen, embossed, confident. Sometimes charm is camouflage. Derek's charm was deliberate and slow. It hugged the edges of conversation and filled in the gaps where hard questions might be. To the casual observer, he might have seemed like an energetic real estate entrepreneur with a soft spot for people. That was the problem with people like him. They practiced empathy as a currency and spend it on your trust. I did not tell Sophia that I had contacted Jennifer and Eleanor. I did not tell Derek that Harold had found matches in state filings. The element of surprise is less a tactic and more a necessity when the person across from you thinks themselves invulnerable. If you tell a predator you know, you ford the river of their confidence. Instead, I began to assemble a narrative. I wrote a statement, a simple document in my own hand, listing the ways Derek had pressured me, the exact language he'd used about selling, the dates he'd suggested agents. I printed out invoices that showed repairs he had requested but not paid for. I photocopied texts that showed him cajoling Sophia into hosting open houses and cutting corners. I made a list of contractors who had been left unpaid and who resented being dismissed. Each piece of paper felt like another small lamp placed along a dark hallway. There is a peculiar bravery in paperwork. It is impersonal, Gnostic almost. It reduces heartbreak and theft to bullet points and numbers. That objectivity has power. It also gives you breathing room. When the evidence exists beyond your memory, you do not need to be the person to tell the story. The paper will, in a deputized way, do that for you. As the folder filled, so did my resolve. But resolve is not courage. Resolve is the capacity to keep moving when feelings vacillate. I vacillated. I vacillated when Sophia brought home a dinner of takeout with an apologetic flourish that felt to me performative. I vacillated when Derek complimented the way I'd hung a print in my hallway, praising my taste, as if the words suggested he had chosen well. And there was guilt threaded into my determination. I loved my daughter. The thought of accusing her husband of setting in motion a public stain on her life scratched at me like a child's fingernail. I told myself, repeatedly and with mechanical calm, that the stain might be cleaner than the slow erosion that came from losing everything. In the quietest parts of night, I asked whether I was protecting my home or exacting pride's revenge. The answer slid between both truths. It was at the end of a week, thick with phone calls and small victories. Harold had found a suspicious transfer linked to a property that matched Eleanor's address. Jennifer had shared a vendor who confirmed work done and not paid. That Sophia came into my room and sat on the edge of my bed with a softness I had not seen in weeks. "Mom," she said, "I know you're upset, but Deke works hard. He loves me. He wants us to be safe." She used the diminutive without asking, as if safety could be purchased with endearments. I put the file away in a drawer and met her eyes. "Safety sometimes has a price," I said. "Sometimes it's a price someone else pays." She blinked. "He wouldn't hurt you?" "No," I said, and meant both the literal impossible and the larger truth. People do hurt people they love, complicatedly and unintentionally, and sometimes with a profit motive that makes the hurting deliberate. Sophia left the room with a small kiss on my forehead, a reconciliation offered like a bandage. By the time they came home that night, I had papers in a folder thick enough to make a sound when I set it on the counter. I had names and dates and enough corroboration to make an argument. I had a moral calculus that still hurt when I thought about it, and I had, in the quiet of the late hours, written the first draft of a complaint. I did not file that complaint yet. There was one more thing I needed to be sure of, that the narrative I had assembled would hold up against the charm machine Derek had perfected. Evidence is not only proof, it is inoculation against the gaslights. When they walked in from the car, Derek carried a small bouquet. He smelled like someone who had been successful enough to enjoy it. He kissed Sophia as if their union was sturdily built on trust. He glanced at the folder on the counter and smiled as if to say, "The house is ours." He did not know then that I had already started to make a ledger of his days. He did not know that I had a name for what I suspected. There was a calmness in the room then, as if a storm were a rumor and we were still under blue sky. I set the table for dinner like the hostess who keeps the peace. I kept my voice measured. I kept my eyes on the way his hands rested on the back of his chair. He said grace in a way that made it sound like a contract. He praised my salmon. He told a story about a charity event where he'd been honored for his community work. He used we again, like a chorus. I answered politely. I laughed when appropriate. All the while, my folder sat like a silent actor awaiting its cue. When they went to bed, the house sighed. I turned the lock on the front door with a hand that didn't tremble as much as I thought it might. In the kitchen, the keys lay where Sophia had put them. The ocean outside thinned into a sheet of silver. I made one more list before I slept. It was short and clinical. Call the State Consumer Protection Line, speak to an investigator about elder targeting fraud, get names of agents who handle financial crimes. I wrote Herald to draft complaint and underlined it. I signed the page with my name as if it were a promise. There is a peculiar clarity that comes with decision. The choice to act sharpened everything else, friendships, loyalties, the old ache in my chest where grief had once lived. I felt, with a precise and lonely joy, the start of possibilities. If Derek was who I suspected, then he was part of a larger fabric that preyed on quiet houses and trusting people. If he was not, if I had misread, the worst that would happen would be a strained family dinner and a story I would need to apologize for. If he was, then I would have done what I could to stop him. I slept poorly that night, floating between dreams of courtrooms and small domestic scenes of sand and sunlight. Dawn was a rumor when they padded into the kitchen, voices hushed. Derek praised the light as if he had discovered it. Sophia asked if I'd be ready for an early breakfast tomorrow, reminding me of the first day with the same casual presumption. I made my coffee, watching the steam unfurl like a little flag. I thought about the way a single morning request had shifted the axis of my life. Breakfast at 5 had seemed at first an imposition. Later it felt like an invitation, a tiny lever that would pry open a locked door if I was stubborn enough to push. The lever moves slowly. Evidence takes time. Courage, too, takes time. I would not rush either. I folded the complaint into a folder and slid it into my bag. Outside, the ocean winked. Inside, on my kitchen counter, the keys lay where Sophia had placed them, small brass promises waiting for an unlocked future. I set the folder into my bag and walked out into the dawn, as if I were only taking out the trash. The ocean was low and soft, and for a few moments, the day kept pretending it still belonged to me. Then the day remembered its other duties, and people came home again with plans. The breakfast request, 5 a.m., had become a hinge. It hung in my head like a clock I could not stop listening to. I told myself that the morning thing mattered because it exposed an attitude. An attitude is the skeleton behind a plan. It is remarkably easy to dress contempt in the language of care. We'll take care of the details. We'll keep you worry-free. The words are velvet. The consequences are concrete. There's an odd compression of time in the weeks that followed. Small details, at first barely audible, began forming sentences by themselves. A late payment here. A contractor who would not answer the phone there. Eleanor's voice on the line writing itself into my gut, the way a needle traces a map. I worried, often painfully, not only about property, but about how quietly a life can be rearranged by someone who knows which hinge creaks the loudest. I also worried about myself. At some point in that blur, I did something I regret and have wrestled with ever since. It's important to say it plainly, because I refused for a long time to let myself name it, and naming is how people keep themselves honest. One morning, While they were still asleep and while the kitchen simmered with the small, quiet rituals I'd built over decades, I did a petty and irreversible thing. I sabotaged his breakfast. There's no poetic spin that makes this noble. It was a mean little act by a woman who felt cornered. He became ill. I won't describe how because the details are irrelevant and, frankly, dangerous if repeated. You don't need a recipe to understand the moral. The consequence was that Derek was taken to urgent care that day. He was made uncomfortable and he sought medical attention. That medical visit became the kind of small, unlikely opening that allows other things to happen. Questions asked, blood work taken, a record filed. If you think that sounds like triumph, you'd be missing the other half. I lay awake that night with the cold, nascent knowledge that I had crossed a line. There was a sense of relief, yes, because the veneer of his composure had been scraped. There was also shame, because I had become, for a sliver of time, what I despised. I thought about the way my hands had made the choice. They looked like someone else's. I thought about how justice tastes like metal when it's mixed with revenge. Law enforcement did not come to my house because of my small private sin. They came because patterns add up. Harold, with the precise and patient rage of a man who loves accounting the way other people love gardening, had taken my folder and made it speak. He'd faxed, called, and emailed until a paper trail that had been only a rumor was now visible to the eyes that cared. The State Consumer Protection Office answered a call, then another. Detective Sarah Chen from the California State Police Financial Crimes Division called back. Her voice was brisk and not unkind. She knew the cadence of someone who works with people whose quiet losses compound into public harms. "You stayed put and collected," she said, when I finally met her in person. Her office smelled faintly of copier toner and lemon cleaner. She had a notebook with neat columns and a way of looking at fingerprints of conversation like they were evidence. "Good work, Miss Whitmore. Don't do anything you'll need to explain." Detective Chen did not play at drama. She explained in the simple language Harold and I liked what the state could do and what would be better left to a federal team. Elder targeting schemes often cross county lines. They build on the anonymity of LLCs and the tangle of deeds. That's how they scale. They structure trust and then monetize it, property by property. She asked me for everything I had, copies of invoices, dates, emails. She did not ask about the breakfast. That would come later, in a different tone. The next call came from a person whose title I'd seen in television dramas but never in my kitchen. Agent Martinez from the FBI's Financial Crimes Task Force. He spoke with the low, bureaucratic patience of someone who had learned not to be surprised by the things people do in the name of profit. Agent Kim, his partner, asked questions that had the dry clinicalism of a doctor taking a history. They were careful and respectful, in a way that made me feel, perversely, that I was being protected more than interrogated. "You've done the right thing putting this together," Agent Kim said. "What you have, multiple victims, similar transfers, might be more than a local grift." I felt the sentence like a tide. It pulled at the shorelines of my fear. They suggested a meeting where we could line up witnesses. They needed the people who'd been bruised into speaking. For victims like Eleanor and Jennifer, who had been told they were being helped and then lost things, bureaucracy can feel like a second hurt. The idea of telling the story again, of making someone else read your small losses, is exhausting. We held a living room meeting that felt oddly formal. Jennifer sat on my couch with her hands in her lap, like a person waiting for news at the doctor. Eleanor had permission to be there. She came with a neighbor who drove her and made sure she could find the right chairs. Harold and I laid out the folder like a mute witness. The agents sat with professional gravity and recorded the names, dates, and patterns. Sophia, to her credit, and with a complexity that made my chest ache, sat across from me with a face that looked as if it had been wetted and punched. There was tension, yes, but not the white-hot kind I'd imagined. Mostly, there was the quiet, aching confusion of people who had to decide whether to believe that the man they thought they knew could have been working another plane. Sophia's face was a map of different choices. Sometimes it looked like regret, sometimes like defense. When Detective Chen asked if she had signed anything, they required her to hand over what she had: phone logs, texts, a piece of a notebook where Derek had jotted contractors' names. It was not grand. It was, like all important things, domestic. A signature, an unchecked box, a trust given where a ledger should have been demanded. "What can we expect?" Eleanor asked me, voice small. "You can expect that we will do what we can," Chen answered. "We'll follow the paper. We'll listen." It sounded trite in the moment and then, later, like a promise. The agents told us there was an operational plan being shaped, a way to catch a suspect by letting him show himself. How they would do that I will not and cannot describe. I will say only that law enforcement prefers evidence collected within legal bounds, and that evidence assembled by victims, mail, receipts, dates of visits, makes the best kind of case. That is what we had, a stack of small, stubborn facts that refused to be charmed away. The days that followed felt like sitting on a train in which you can see the station approach and also see scrawled warnings that tell you to brace. Derek continued to play the part of the considerate husband. He brought me flowers sometimes and praised my dish towels like they were exhibits. He talked about helping seniors transition at neighborhood gatherings and shook hands with people who assumed him to be philanthropic. To others he was generous and lively. To me he was a man whose smile had been used so often I could see the strain in its corners. I began to watch him, not because I enjoyed it, but because it was necessary. When he left the house, he carried a briefcase or a gym bag. Sometimes he carried nothing at all. He would make promises about contacting a realtor friend and then not make the call. He would mention casually that a company was interested in modernizing my home. He was, in short, a man cultivating an image that could be wielded when needed. One silver morning, ironically still light and soft as linen, he returned to the house unusually late. I was in the kitchen, not for him, but because my rituals have an inertia I cannot break. He walked through the door with a heaviness in his gait that did not belong to the man who flitted about charity events. Behind him were shadows, like footprints. The mood in the house tightened as if someone had turned down the thermostat. I should say now. The sting that followed was not cinematic the way movies make it. It was by contrast bureaucratically tense. Agents in plain clothes arrived at staggered times. They were patient. They moved like people who had rehearsed patience and then used it as a tool. They asked for nothing more of me than I had already prepared. They asked me to keep my normal pace. In many ways, their calm was more frightening than any raised voice, because it promised things could go very wrong if anyone panicked. Derek noticed the people who were there in time, and his face folded. For a second, he was a man reading a script that had suddenly been lost. He tried to smile and then to charm. The room filled with a quality I can only call exposure, like someone taking your photograph without warning. He tried to talk his way through it. His vocabulary of soft deception is rich. It has been practiced. He became angry, sharply, when he realized what was happening. There was a moment, disquieting, dark, where his temper-thorned armor fell away and old violence peeked out. He pulled something from his jacket in a way that made everyone begin to move. That image of a man who had long cultivated warmth turning toward threat is something I still have trouble describing without my chest tightening. What followed was fast, in the way ocean swells are fast. Agents moved, voices rose with authority. The house became loud with commands and shoes and the scent of disinfectant. I do not want to give the impression that the scene was some grand, heroic storm. It was chaos, small and immediate, Derek was taken into custody. Handcuffs are a blunt instrument of law, but necessary. They are the moment when a performance ends and paper begins. I stood in the kitchen and watched the little domestic tableau that had been my life disassemble. For a long time, I could not breathe properly. The house felt like a stage where actors had left their props in odd places. An empty mug, a chair pushed back from the table, the keys Sophia had thrown onto the counter weeks ago. The beach outside kept being patient. The ocean did the thing oceans do. It continued on, huge and indifferent. Detection is a funny thing to live through. On one hand, you feel vindicated. You were right to notice, to document, to act. On the other hand, there's a grief that comes when a person who once called you mama is led away in cuffs. You cultivate two opposing emotions at once, and then learn to live with them without making them fight. Derek was charged thereafter with a series of counts related to financial fraud. The attempted assault escalated the case from a property scheme to a violent crime thread. The agents told me about the tendrils they found as they followed Derek's transactions. Shell companies, a string of properties, contractors left unpaid, and people's lives rearranged. They used a phrase I will never forget: heartbreak network. It sounded flippant on paper, but it was not in reality. It referred to an organized group that used emotional relationships as its mechanism for theft. Marcus Webb, they said, was the name at its center, or at least one of them. He had partners and a map of operations across states. There were hearings, subpoenas, and a steady, insistent paperwork that felt alternately like justice and like more bureaucracy. Eleanor came to testify. Her voice trembled, but it held. Jennifer stood and described the business she had lost. Sophia did the bravest thing someone can do in these circumstances. She told the truth. She told how she had been wooed, how trust had been folded into trust as if that would make the removal of property somehow benevolent. She cried in court sometimes. She sat with me other times and folded my hand into hers. She made the hard choice to separate. She filed for divorce. There were negotiations and plea deals and a trial that lasted longer than any one day feels like it should. Derek's charm was a point of contention. His lawyers called him a misunderstood entrepreneur. Our side called him what he had been to other people, a manipulator. The law, in many ways, is the difference between a persuasive script and an actionable offense. You need documents, voices, witnesses. That's why the folder on my kitchen counter mattered so much. It allowed private sorrow to become public evidence. The heartbreak network was bigger than we suspected at first. Marcus Webb, whose name surfaced in spreadsheets and in wire transfers, had a pattern of recruiting people adept at feigning intimacy, someone who could promise help and then file the right papers at the right time. The network relied on the veneer of care and on transference. Younger people, charismatic and seeming to care, would get close to older homeowners and then start rearranging affairs. It was a cruel business model because it weaponized relationships. When Marcus was arrested months later, it felt like the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. He did not act alone. The investigations spread outward like rings on a pond. Agents from other states coordinated. Testimony from people who had once thought they were being helped came in like a counterpoint that fixed the outline of the scheme. Local prosecutors and the federal teams worked together. Those moments, when a person with an investigation into their hands finally agrees that a pattern has meaning, are odd and profound. It's as if a crowd slowly agrees a story should be told aloud. After the arrests, there was cleanup. There were restitution hearings, and for some victims, the impossibility of having their memories worthily restored. Money helps, of course it does. But some losses, like Eleanor's garden, are less about dollars and more about a life's continuity. The court can award damages. It cannot give back 50 years of roses tended by a pair of patient hands. That was the part that stuck to me hardest. People asked me sometimes whether it felt like revenge. I would say no, and then try to untangle the answer. I had wanted accountability, certainly. I had wanted the pattern stopped. I had not wanted bloodshed or to watch a loved one's life unravel publicly. When the truth is complicated, you do what is necessary and then live with the rest. I confessed those private misdeeds, my petty sabotage, to the agents. They listened, took notes, and folded the confession into their files. I do not know whether it would have mattered for any legal outcome. I only know that I felt compelled to say it aloud and to accept whatever consequences would come. The law is not the only judge. My conscience had been sitting on my shoulder like a small, insistent bird. What surprised me most after the arrests was how much my life rearranged itself, not because anything had to be fixed, but because something in me had been unlatched. The house that had felt under siege became, paradoxically, a platform. People called asking for my story. The state's Elder Protection Unit asked if I would speak to groups of seniors. Harold suggested I take notes and be methodical in what I shared, because anecdote matters when it is joined to evidence. You document, you teach, he said, in the plain tone he used when handing me complicated information. I began doing small things at first. I would sit in a municipal meeting and talk about the red flags people often dismiss. The sudden suggestion to change a will, a request to move accounts, the way a person might be isolated under the pretense of help. I spoke at a community center where people ate coffee cake and listened with the kind of attention that gets carved into your chest. I explained without shame how I had been wrong to let shame keep me quiet. I explained the importance of paperwork. I explained that loving someone does not mean handing them blank checks. My talks were not legal lectures. They were scenes and warnings and sometimes apologies packed into an hour. I told the story bluntly. The breakfast, the folder, the agents, the arrest. I told people how alive and ordinary predators can seem. I told them how to make evidence of their own lives, keep receipts, note dates, photocopy signatures. I was careful never to give advice that might be used to harm. Rather, I stressed the civil things that protect you, documentation and the presence of witnesses. Soon, the requests multiplied. A state hotline wanted me to share my testimony. A federal training unit asked if I would consult for their agents to share the victim's perspective. I had never thought of myself as a teacher. I had thought for decades that my work was quiet and practical, coaxing roses to bloom, balancing a checkbook, showing up. But the thing that had been a hinge, the sunrise request, was turning the house of my life into a small kind of podium. I traveled to speak at workshops. I would arrive with a small folder of my own and say, plainly, this is what I found. I spoke to prosecutors who wanted to know how charm is used as a vector for theft. I spoke to caseworkers who asked the blunt question, what made you decide to act? I told them, a mixture of stubbornness, grief, and the refusal to be patronized. That honesty opened doors I had not planned to walk through. My role evolved naturally into consultation. I sat in an FBI briefing once and listened to agents talk about operations in language that made my head swim. They would ask me how Derek had made me feel safe, and then not. They would ask me about Sophia's role, about the ways family members rationalize. I would tell them how predators are often good at rehearsing empathy, how they prioritize their own narrative. I also told them over and over that the best resource for prosecution is patient documentation. Paper and memory together are the way you move private pain into the public square. There were days I could not reconcile the delight of being useful with the fact that my life had been rearranged by violence, by attempted theft. Grief did not evaporate just because I was busy. Some mornings I still wake and smell the sea and think of the roses as if nothing else had happened. The house keeps making breakfast the way it always did, and will always do. Morning tasks that are stubbornly ordinary. Sophia and I had to rebuild things in a way that does not fit neatly on a page. She moved into a small apartment of her own after divorcing Derek. She found a counselor who understood the particular shame that accrues when you realize your romantic life has been chosen for other people's gain. She worked, the way many people do after trauma, at the small practices that stitch together new identity. A routine, a job, friends who did not ask too many questions. She apologized in a way that wasn't theatrical, and I accepted in a way that was not naive. Forgiveness and caution are not the same thing. They are two different tools you use to live together without being broken by the past. There were other strange, tender things. Jennifer reopened a small shop with a friend's help and called it a second chance boutique. Eleanor planted a new rose bush and insisted on pruning it herself. Harold retired with a small party and a speech about stubborn clients who stay true. Agents Martinez and Kim sent me a short note, an email that contained gratitude and the slightly funny language of people who saw their jobs as public service. Marcus Webb's trial was long and procedural and made of paper. Derek pled guilty, eventually, to several counts. The sentences did not make everyone feel whole, but they made a record and created an example. What surprises me most is that the sunrise request, the tiny, presumptuous note tossed on my counter, remains my favorite image of what people do when they mean to change your life without asking. That small domestic request, breakfast at 5, was a way of telling me in the soft language of expectation that my days were theirs to purchase. It was for me the moment the world tilted. When I think of the ways things changed, I no longer see myself as only a victim. I see a woman who turned alarm into action. I see someone who learned that documentation has a dignity of its own. I see a person who, through discomfort and missteps and a shameful small revenge I will always have to account for to myself, took a dossier of life and used it to stop a pattern. The public work I do now, training agents, speaking at senior centers, sitting on panels, is in part a penance. It is also a calling. I teach people how to hold on to their stories in a way that the law can understand. In time, the house changed too. We did some of what Sophia suggested, smaller changes that made living simpler, but I kept the things that mattered. I kept my garden, even as we trimmed things for safety and accessibility. At night I would sometimes stand on the stoop and watch the horizon where the sea meets the sky. The mornings are softer now. They carry the smell of coffee and the quiet knowledge that something big once shifted on a small hinge. People ask me if I regret that I did not walk away sooner. The answer is tangled. I regret the part of me that made a spiteful choice in the kitchen. I do not regret that I fought slowly and with papers and agents and witnesses to stop a pattern that could have taken other people's lives apart. Regret and pride can exist in the same chest. They are not mutually exclusive. There are practical things I tell people now when I talk at community centers or on panels. I tell them to keep copies of important papers, to ask for second opinions, to keep friends in the loop if someone new comes into their life suddenly and asks to manage their affairs. I tell them to be wary of fast intimacy and slow paperwork. I tell them gently that predators do not always look like monsters. They look like the person bringing cookies and saying, "Let me help." I also tell them with candor that rage sometimes tempts us into mistakes and that owning those mistakes is part of getting better. I have been invited to help design training modules that focus on how to listen to victims and on the red flags that are more emotional than numerical. I travel no longer as a person who wants to stay out of the world's sight, but as someone who understands that visibility can be a protection. I speak honestly about the moral tension of my own actions, because I think that honesty is a form of prevention. People who know the whole story are less likely to romanticize the end result and more likely to understand the cost. Sophia writes to me now with photos of her small balcony garden. She sends me a text sometimes at dawn. "Morning, Mama. Coffee?" And I answer because some routines are worth saving. She has found new friends who are steady and unflashy. She works part-time and volunteers at a community kitchen. She is careful. She is brave in ways that are quiet. She still makes mistakes. She will always, as will I, be a person trying to live as a better person. The house eventually became something else, and also stayed the same. I worked with a nonprofit to host seminars on elder financial safety. I sat in a congressional hearing to share my story, to tell a panel full of people in suits and with microphones how charm had been used as currency. That day, my voice did not shake as much as I expected. The room had warmth. People had listened. I spoke about small things, receipts, witnesses, the way a folder can be a missile, but also a shield. I spoke about the sunrise request, how such a tiny domestic demand could prove to be the first visible thread of a much larger pattern. Every time I stand up to speak now, I bring the folder with me. It is not a prop. It is evidence that ordinary life has edges and that those edges matter. I bring it because I want people to see the transition from private hurt to public accountability. I want them to know that one woman's persistence can lead to an investigation that pulls a network into light. I want them to know that elder fraud is not a whispered horror but a solvable crime if people document and report it. The sunrise request changed everything because it forced me to see the governance of my life as something I could protect. The little demand to be a cook for someone else's schedule became, in my head, a metaphor for how easily trust can be traded for profit. It taught me that the line between care and control is thin, and that we must guard the elderly with practical tools and legal allies. If my story helps even one person see a pattern sooner, then the house that almost became someone else's will have kept paying dividends not in money, but in people saved. People have told me my work is inspiring. I have been honored to work with agents and prosecutors and nonprofits. But the real honor is simple, sitting with someone who has been betrayed and helping them move from silence to action, from humiliation to agency. There is finally a peace in the small rituals. Tea poured at the time I choose, the sound of the kettle and the gulls arguing somewhere beyond the edge of the world. The keys Sophia tossed on my counter the day she arrived are still in the same bowl, but now I can look at them without the old immediate shame. I can remember the morning she said casually, "Make breakfast at 5, and know that those 4 words were the beginning of a long and difficult, but ultimately clarifying chapter. If you are watching this and you suspect the quiet rearrangement of your life, if there are small presumptions asked of you that speak of a larger plan, document it. Find an ally. Keep your papers. Ask questions. Trust that the law can be on your side if you make what happened visible in a way it can understand. And if you have a story, if you've been touched by someone who asked you to change your life under the pretense of care, please share it. We learn from each other. We act together. We stop the pattern by refusing to let it be invisible. If this story resonated, subscribe for more first-hand accounts and practical resources on elder fraud and relationship scams. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and seek out local hotlines and state resources if you or someone you love is in a similar situation. Dawn arrives every day. Sometimes an ordinary request, a breakfast at 5, can be the lever that wakes you up. Sometimes it wakes an entire community.